This presentation is for cadet pilots, what to prepare before starting line flying. So why did I make this presentation? To make your life easier, because usually there is a lot of information overload and it is not always clear what you should focus on studying before you start to fly on the line. Please take notes from this presentation. I don't have any specific handout, and you can also make screenshots, of course. So because there are many different airlines, of course, with many different SOPs, I try to make this presentation as general as possible. So if you want to know any details, please refer to your company manuals. One thing I should make clear is that in this presentation there might be some techniques discussed. There's a difference between techniques and SOPs. SOPs, standard operating procedures, they are very specific to the aircraft and to the company, and they are sort of set in or written in stone. They should not be open to interpretation. However, techniques, these are things which are not written anywhere specifically, and there are likely differences between instructors of how they want you to do things, even within the same company. This is quite common, and this is unfortunately something which you cannot really get around. So you will encounter different instructors teaching you different things, but this shouldn't really be a problem. Just take note of all the different ways of doing things and pick the one you feel most comfortable with. Okay, taking notes. During line training and also during ground school, this is very important because, as mentioned before, there will likely be information overload, and if you organize things on paper or on a file on your laptop or PC, then it will also be organized in your mind. Also, I highly recommend that you make your own notes. It might be tempting to use notes from somebody else, which is not necessarily a bad thing to do, but you have to keep in mind that for one thing, notes of other people might be outdated, and they might be open to interpretation, or they might be plainly wrong. And you want to make sure that if you do something wrong, that you don't have the excuse, oh, but this other person, he gave me this note and it says I should do such and such. Of course, that is not a good thing to say. If you say, oh, I misinterpreted the manual myself, or I didn't know that, okay, that's one thing, but you shouldn't be able to blame somebody else. Sometimes I see people making no notes at all during line training or during a difficult or a complex ground course, and that just makes me think, if somebody doesn't make any notes at all, has that person a very good memory, or is he or she just not motivated? It could be both. I think most people, they don't have a photographic memory. They don't remember everything they hear and say. I certainly don't. So please keep that in mind and make some notes and make your life easier. Okay, so what is the recommended things to make notes about? One thing is custom checklists. Of course, there are checklists from the aircraft itself, but there are always situations where there are no checklists for, but it would be very handy if you have something written either as a PDF on your iPad if you use that in your company, or just on a piece of paper. Things like what to do if a runway changes, or what to do after an engine failure once you've done all the items you should do. You cleaned up the aircraft, etc., and you've done the ECAM, you finished the ECAM. What should you do now? Okay, get the weather, check any NOTAMs if there are any, let ATC know, etc., etc. So things like this, it's very handy to have some custom checklist for that. The other thing is the differences between instructors, which I mentioned before. When I started flying in the beginning, and sometimes it still is an issue, that one instructor tells you one thing, and then the next one will tell you something else, and they both insist that you do it their way. Okay, so the way around this is just to make notes for the specific items instructors do differently. And then next time you fly, or not even necessarily an instructor, but maybe just a normal captain, and next time you fly with that captain, you look up your notes, and then you go, oh, okay, yeah, this captain doesn't want me to push this button or say this thing, and this will make your life a lot easier if you keep track of the specific differences between pilots. Airport notes are also very handy. Most companies will give you a manual where they have notes about specific airports you fly to, usually OMC, but this is not always either up to date or written in a practical manner. So it's very handy if you make your own notes about the airfields you fly to, and things can be written in a way such as, okay, this airport, the PAPI is not very visible, or it's got a large offset for the VOR approach, or there's terrain in this location, or there's a very difficult go-around procedure, please check before your flight, things like this. It will make your life definitely a lot easier. And then every time you fly to that new airfield, you can look up your notes to see what is there to focus on. I certainly do that also, and it is very handy for airfields I rarely fly to. Then it will help a lot to make your life easier and prevent any mistakes. Notes making during line training, very important also, because again, there is likely to be information overload. A lot of information has to be absorbed, and there's absolutely no way you can remember it all. So please do make notes of all the things your instructor tell you during line training. Also, for the briefing and the debriefing, if there are any interesting points, it's always good to write down some notes on a piece of paper and then later organize it nicely in your notebook or on your computer. The other thing is SOPs. Now this might seem a bit strange, because as SOPs, they are written in the manuals, and why would you make any notes about the SOPs? Well, a couple of reasons. Sometimes the SOPs as written in the manual are not so clear, at least not perhaps to a new pilot. So you could make some extra notes about when or where you should do a certain thing. The other thing is that it is very common for airlines to have the SOPs scattered throughout various manuals. There are some things in the FCOM, in the FCTM, in OMA, and perhaps in OMB. And so in my experience, at least, usually there are SOPs written in about 4 different manuals, and it's just hard to keep track of it, especially in the beginning. So it is very handy if you consolidate all these SOPs into one single document and make it formatted in such a way that is for you. It's very clear what you should say and what you should do at which time. You can see here so some notes I have made before. And so this is how I organize it. This is for the SOP. So I write, there's this dotted line, which is a condition. If this happens, you have to say that. And then you can see in red who says it, pilot flying or pilot monitoring. In bold and between brackets is what you say. And the other things is what you do. This is just an example. I don't want to say that you have to do it like this. It doesn't really matter. But whatever way you make the notes for your SOPs, as long as it makes sense for you, then it's fine. Okay, so before you start line flying, you will be very likely be scheduled for observation flights. So these are flights where you don't sit in a control seat, you will sit on the jump seat, and you will have to observe normal line flying. And this is very useful to learn things, but it's important that you do this in a certain way. You can't just sit there and expect something to learn something. You actually have to actively involve yourself in the process. So one thing to do is to pretend that you are either pilot monitoring or pilot flying, and then think about what you would do or what you would say next for the SOPs. This will get your brain going. Next is to pay attention to the SOPs itself. As said before, it's not always clear in what order or when you have to do certain SOP items, and then you can ask the crew or just pay attention to how they do it and then take some notes from that. Very important to ask questions. I'm sure that you will have questions before you start line flying, and usually the crew will be very happy to help you out. Also, please join the takeoff calculations with the crew, so the CG, the weight, and the V speeds. Depending on your company, there might be different ways to do this. There might be an automated system using an iPad or a laptop, or you might use paper manuals for that. Either way, it's very important that you join the crew with the calculations to see if you understand and if you get the same figures. Also very handy that if you do a flight with a training captain or an examiner, then ask if you can do the radio and set up the FMS if there is no other training going on in that part. For example, if the training captain does a training flight with another cadet, it's probably not a good time to ask if you can set up the FMS, because the other pilot is doing that then and learning that. But if it's perhaps just a normal flight where no training is going on, it happens to be a training captain, or the first officer flying is very experienced, further in his training, so he doesn't need to learn about the FMS anymore, as such that you can, for example, ask to set up the FMS on the ground. And same with the radio, that if you fly with a somewhat more experienced FO who knows how to operate the radio already, then you can ask if you can do the radio. So get the clearance, get the weather, do all the radio stuff. This will help a lot, because especially the radio, it's not as easy as it seems in the beginning. Okay, there are a few things you should know by heart before you start line flying. These are flow patterns, both for pilot flying and pilot monitoring. Memory items, very important. Limitations I should put in there also. ECAM handling and SOPs, because it can actually happen that you get a ECAM warning during normal line training. These flights are normal flights, and things sometimes break. Usually computers, they have some glitches, and most ECAMs, they are not too complicated from experience, although it can be, of course, but most of them is just a single or ECAM line without anything to do, or just a simple reset. But it's good that you know what the ECAM SOPs are, because you are part of the crew and you will have to do that properly. The other one is pilot incapacitation. This is also very important, that you know what to do once the unthinkable happens. And it is possible. You will fly with a safety pilot the first couple of sectors. This is to make sure that you can land the aircraft alone. And once you can land the aircraft without too much, without any assistance, verbally or physically, then you should be able to operate the aircraft alone. But in practice, this is still very difficult for a number of reasons. One is descent management. It is really not that easy. And the other one is the sheer workload and stress related to that. But there are two things which you should ask yourself, and this is something which instructors sometimes disagree with. So I will not give you my final opinion about it, but it's just something to think about, is that would you do an auto land? Okay, now if you struggle yourself with handling and you have been released to fly without a safety pilot, but you still find yourself find it very difficult to land the aircraft properly, you might consider setting the aircraft up for an auto land. One thing to be very careful about though is that first you can't land the aircraft with an auto land in most airfields because well, depending when you fly, okay, but most airfields, they are not certified for Cat 3 operations. Some are, some larger airfields are, but certainly not most smaller airfields. And you shouldn't really do an auto land on a Cat 1 ILS. The other thing is that very likely there are no low visibility procedures in force, so you will have to tell ATC that you will do an auto land, otherwise an aircraft might taxi past the antenna and the glide slope might fluctuate, which you definitely don't want during an auto land, especially not during the flare. And there might be something broken in the aircraft preventing you or prohibiting you from doing an auto land, and you will have to check the tech log. So things will start to the workload starts to pile up pretty quickly if you are going to do an auto land. There are some SOPs involved, you should check that it flares, etc, etc. The other thing is that you are not trained to be pilot flying for an auto land, so just keep that in mind. If you do want to set up an outland, okay, but there are certainly things you have to keep in mind for that. The other one is the landing checklist. Some airlines, they want you to call in one of the cabin crew to help you with the landing checklist, but this is another thing where you have to be very careful with, because the landing checklist is done at a very low altitude, and most airlines, cabin crew are not trained for that, so they don't know what to cross-check and they don't know what the replies should be. So if you say the cabin crew might say A/THR, and you go like, what? A/THR? What does that mean? And you go, oh, it's auto thrust. And then you say speed. And then the cabin crew say, but Captain, it says here you have to say speed/off, and there will be a lot of distractions, and it will just be more trouble than it's worth, especially when you're so close to the ground. And the main reason why two pilots do a checklist is that they both cross-check what's being checked on the checklist, and of course the cabin crew have no idea what they're cross-checking anyway. So just keep that in mind, that if the airline does want you to get one of the cabin crew to help you with the landing checklist. Okay, next item. So the other thing is to know by heart is how to deal with the flight documents you need. Things like the operational flight plan, NOTAMs, weather, etc, etc. So before your flight, when you're in the crew room, you have to check certain documents, and you want to make sure that you know how to do that. So pay attention how to do these things during your observation flights, and ask as many questions as possible, so that there's no doubts in your mind once you start line flying. The other thing, you want to join the crew doing takeoff calculations. As mentioned before, the weight, CG, and the speeds, and so you know that how to do that relatively quickly. The other thing is how to set up the FMS for a takeoff and a landing. FMS is a complex computer. There are many features in it, but at the very least you should be able to know you should know how to relatively quickly set it up for takeoff and also for a landing. The other thing is how to do briefings. Now this is, in most airlines they're quite picky with it. You have to brief in a certain way, in a certain order, or if you have to cover certain things and not cover other things, etc, etc. So whatever your airline wants you to, however they want you to brief and departure and arrival. Make sure that you know how to do that by heart, or either that or looking at some notes, and so you don't forget to brief anything, and also to make it sound like it's relatively smoothly. I remember when I first started flying, I was really terrible with this, and I was like not stuttering, but like having pauses and having to look up things, and it just doesn't really flow well. So you want to make sure that it flows nicely and it's understandable for the other crew member. The other thing to know by heart before you start line flying, very important, is checklist responses. So checklists are sometimes dependent on the company. Most companies use standard Airbus checklists, but not all do, and some have some modifications in it. And sometimes Airbus changes their official checklist, so you have to make sure that you know how to call out all these checklist responses. So that's important. Next, line training. Okay, so line flying, except for base training, line flying is done with normal passenger flights and no extra time allocated for that usually. So that's one thing to keep in mind. There will be time pressure, sometimes in the air also if you're doing short flights, but depending on your airline, the A320 usually is used for shorter turnarounds, sometimes half an hour, sometimes more, but there will definitely be time pressure, which is again another reason why you should know at least as much as possible the things discussed in this presentation. So if there are short flights can be as little as 20 minutes or 30 minutes, then there will be very little time to explain things. The training captain will not have much time to explain things during the flight, so keep that in mind. The more prepared you are, the faster you will learn. That's just the way the mind of the brain works, that if you are overloaded, then it will become much harder to pick up new information. So make sure that you stay ahead of the game. Landing, this unfortunately you cannot learn to land the aircraft from a book, same with descent management, but landing even more so is a thing which really requires hands-on experience. And some people are very quick to learn this, others they're very slow to learn this. It's a bit of a left-right brain thing, but regardless, it will take time. Descent management, of course, that's mostly what this channel is about. It's a complex subject, and one of the things which makes it more harder also is that different instructors are likely to use different calculation methods. In the book there's one recommended calculation, but some instructors might insist that you use their method. That shouldn't be a problem because it's only a small section of the whole subject, but that's just something to keep in mind, that you will probably encounter different methods of calculation. The book is available on Amazon if you're interested, and there's an ebook and a paperback version available. So further for line training, it's important to learn from mistakes. Sometimes I see cadet pilots making the same mistake over and over again, and this really slows down your progress. So okay, it's normal to make mistakes, not a problem at all, but make sure you learn from it and then don't make the same mistake again. If you do make the same mistake again, okay, then try to not make it again and again. So learn from your mistakes, that's very important. If you don't understand something, please ask for clarification. When I first started flying, or even in flight school, I remember I was asking questions all the time, and I was pretty much the only one in my class. Everybody just sat there pretending they understood it, and I thought that I was the only one who just didn't get it and asking questions all the time. But in hindsight, that wasn't quite the case. Others, they also struggled with various subjects, but they just didn't ask anything, and I found it quite strange, because why not ask? But maybe I guess in a classroom it's a bit harder, because if everybody is asking questions all the time, there wouldn't be much time to explain. But at least if you're flying on the line, there's only 2 people there, so please do ask something if it's not clear. It's very important Don't pretend you understand something when you don't. The other thing is to be assertive, speak up. It's still a normal line operation, and the captain can make mistakes. I have certainly made mistakes before, and a cadet picked me up on it, and I was very proud that he spoke up, and somewhat embarrassed that he knew but I didn't, or he saw something coming and I didn't. But this is a very important thing to do as a cadet. Of course, there is a bit of a cockpit gradient, as they call it, where there's a very experienced pilot and a very inexperienced pilot in the flight deck. But don't think that the training captain knows everything and never makes any mistakes, because that is just not the way it works. It's very important that you pay attention. If you see something which doesn't make sense, please speak up. System failures, it might happen. And in fact, I remember on my very first line flight in the Boeing 737, after takeoff, I got a flap disagree. Luckily, of course, there was a safety pilot, and they got me out of my seat pretty quickly and let the safety pilot handle it, because it was just a little bit too much for my first day. But things like this, it can happen. And don't be too shocked by it. You should almost expect it to happen, some ECAM to show up or something else, and just follow the SOPs and run through the failure using the ECAM and the checklist as applicable. If you're in the briefing room, there is usually not enough time allocated for cadet pilots to go through everything, especially when you're new, going through all the weather and the NOTAMs and such. It just takes more time than most pilots need. So it's better that you be in the crew room ahead of time. How much time, that depends on you. You might have to experiment a bit with that. Maybe you need half an hour more or 15 minutes more. But just keep that in mind, that you probably need a bit more time in order to depart on time later. It's usually a good idea to read all the NOTAMs the day before you go flying, because NOTAMs, they can be very long and sometimes somewhat complex and hard to understand, and in order to save time in the crew room, it is very helpful if you read through all the NOTAMs the day before. Of course, things can be updated or removed, so make sure that you check the same day also, but at least you will be able to recognize certain segments and go, oh, okay, I know that this taxiway is closed, etc., etc. So that will save you a lot of time. Okay, so not only line flying is of course important, but also flying in the simulator. And once you start line flying, you will have completed all the mandatory simulator items, but after 6 months you will have to enter the simulator again. So things to keep in mind. Armchair flying, so that's pretending that you're flying. Just close your eyes, sit on your chair, and pretend you go through certain failures, engine out or something like that. And just pretend that you move levers, press buttons, say certain things, check certain instruments, etc., etc. This will help you a lot. Simulator preparation requires a significant amount of studying, even for experienced pilots. This is just the reality. Currently I have more than 10,000 hours on the aircraft, and I study at least a month before, maybe not every day, but every 2 or 3 days, an hour or so. So it does require quite a bit of studying, and especially the couple of days leading up to the sim check. If I have some days off, I might spend like 5 or 6 or sometimes even 8 hours studying. And this is for an experienced pilot. So if you are a cadet, then don't treat this as something easy or you've seen it before. It does require quite a bit of study. All sim sessions, they have mandatory items such as an engine failure after takeoff, EVTO or RTO, rejected takeoff. Other things will be maybe non-precision approaches, go around, evacuation, etc. In most countries there are certain items you have to do every single time you enter the sim. So these are the items that you should definitely prepare for, and then there are other items on the list which are specifically for that simulator session. Usually certain failures, they rotate throughout through the years because it's not possible to cover everything in one or 2 days. So this time you might do hydraulics, and next time you do a sim it might be a flap problem. So this should be indicated in your training syllabus what you can expect. And so it's also important to go through all of these things, everything which any type of information which is available in the FCOM, FCTM, etc., etc. You might also be required to do a raw data ILS in the simulator. This requires practice. You can practice either on the flight simulator on your computer or the real aircraft. Now, doing a raw data ILS in a real aircraft might not be allowed by your airline. It should be, because it's important to practice. But you have to pick your time and day. So if it's very turbulent, you might not want to do it, or if it's at night, you might not want to do it, or if it's after a very long flight and you're tired, that's probably not a good idea. But if the conditions are right and your captain agrees, then it's good to practice sometimes a raw data ILS. And then don't cheat, don't look outside, just look at the instruments until minima. Unless you have too much deviation, then it's better just to look outside. Now, which simulator to use, I will do a video about that some other time, but there are a few simulators which I think are suitable. But one thing, it's important that you use a very accurate joystick with a magnetic hull sensor, so it's very, very sensitive, and also that you get hold of some thrust levers. Personally, I use the HOTAS A10 thrust levers. It's not the same as the A320, but it's very accurate. You can make very, very small adjustments and it will have an effect. So it does the job. And it really helps if you do raw data ILS practicing on the PC flight simulator, or perhaps on your laptop if it's fast enough. Of course, it's not the same as flying in the real aircraft, but it's good enough. It will get your instrument scan up to scratch, and especially if you put a bit of a turbulence and some thermals in the simulator, that it kind of bounces around a bit, that it will really help you to scan. And that is the most important thing during a raw data ILS, to learn how to scan the instruments. There are some other things you can practice on your computer. If you have a good simulator, usually the eCam can be used to go to not maybe all eCams are simulated, but some main ones, maybe some engine failure or hydraulic problem, and then you can use that to pretend that you have two crew, and what would I say if I'm a pilot flying, etc., or pilot monitoring, etc. And the other thing you can use the simulator for is flow patterns. Of course, you can also use just paper or a cardboard printouts for that, but or VR, even better. You can just look around and pretend that you move certain levers and push buttons after an engine start, etc. Raw data ILS already mentioned. FMS setup also. It's really good to use a simulator to know or to learn how to quickly set up an FMS for takeoff and for landing, and maybe other things like holding. Okay, human factors. This is another thing which is important. As mentioned before, it's quite difficult in the beginning. The learning curve will be very steep, and it can put quite a bit of pressure on yourself, leading to perhaps lack of sleep or stress or these things. But if you know that this is going to happen, then it will make it a bit easier, so you can deal with it accordingly. Information overload, I mentioned this a couple of times. This certainly happened to me when I first started flying. At some point I didn't know what to study anymore, but this will likely to happen at some point. That is just a little bit too much. The thing to keep in mind is what helps a lot is just to organize your information using notes and knowing what to focus on. Disappointments will certainly happen. Maybe you will fail a line check or fail a sim check, or maybe you will not progress enough, maybe you will need the safety pilot longer, or maybe you will need more flight hours before you're released on the line compared to your classmates. At some point, disappointments are inevitable. But again, if you know that at some point it will happen, it's not such a shock. And everybody is good at certain things. Maybe some pilots are good at landing, some others are good at studying, knowing the manuals. Either way, everybody's different, and don't feel too bad about yourself if you are struggling with your training at some point. I certainly struggled with my training at some time. Luckily, things will get easier over time. It's a bit like riding a car. It's difficult in the beginning, and later you don't think too much about it. Of course, the aircraft is a lot more complex, so it takes longer, but it's sort of the same effect. At some point, things will get easier. So if you just keep a positive attitude over time, then it will help a lot. The other thing is reasonably rare, but it can happen, is personality clashes. If that does happen, please talk to a trusted colleague, and don't just let it grind inside of you and make you angry about this certain instructor which didn't treat you respectfully or wasn't thoughtful about your situation or whatever the case might be. Unfortunately, aviation is a sector where sometimes people get ahead of themselves, or they are not they forget how difficult it was when they were a cadet a long time ago. Either way, it can happen. Also, maybe the instructor is under personal stress and he's a bit snappy at you. It can happen that there will be personality clashes, and lucky it never happened to me, but I did see it happen to some of my colleagues, and it can be quite unsettling. So please don't keep it to yourself and talk to someone. If there are personality issues between you and the instructor, don't let it get into the way of safety. The ego is never a good thing to have in the flight deck. And of course, we are all human. Everybody has an ego, but just keep in mind that there are still passengers behind you, and it's ego issues could potentially lead to safety issues. So best to just not say anything, leave it until you're on the ground, and then discuss what is bothering you. There could be issues in your personal life. Again, talk to other people. It doesn't necessarily have to be pilots if there's issues in your personal life, but it will affect your performance, especially during high workload situations or during training. And you don't really want to keep serious issues to yourself. It's important to talk to other people. Okay, some other points. So the thing with flying is that there is such a gigantic amount of information to be absorbed. It's absolutely impossible to know everything. I certainly don't know everything, but it's important to know what you have to focus on. And some things are important and other things are not important. And your instructor will help you what to focus on. It's also important that you know where to look up information. So if you don't know something, that you can just look it up in the manual. And it depends a bit what the subject is, though. Some things you should know by heart. Some things, of course, are memory items, but there's other things which are not officially memory items, but there will not be time to look something up, so you should know it by heart. Some other things, especially things which are more the job of the captain, you might not know, but at least know which manual to look it up and how to go through the index and or use the search function if you're using an electronic manual. And otherwise, if you're using a paper manual, it's a bit more complicated because then you can't use the search function, but at least if you know where to look it up, it will help a lot. One other thing that is important that you you continue studying once you are released on the line. It might be tempting to be relieved. Oh, finally, I don't have flying with an instructor anymore. I'm finally flying on the line using with a normal line captain, and it can be tempting to stop studying. But this will come back to bite you later once you do a simulator or a line check. So it's important to keep on studying. This is something I struggled with. Don't believe someone if they say that it's easy. I remember when I first started flying, I would ask something about some subject to one of my colleagues, and they would say, don't worry about it. It's easy. And then I wouldn't worry about it, thinking it's easy, and then I would struggle with it. Because actually maybe it was easy for them, but it certainly wasn't easy for me. So never believe anyone, especially in aviation, if they say that it's easy, because well, for one, it might be easy to them, but the other thing is that maybe they just pretend that they know and they think it's easy just to make themselves look better, but actually that's not quite the case. So don't be complacent, basically. Always be on guard. So that was it. If you have any questions, please leave it in the comments below. Thank you for watching.